Hi, my name is Betsy Starbuck, and I'm going to give you background information regarding the state's current bond debt, as well as the impact that approval of Prop 14 could have on the amount of debt and on the state's annual budget. But first, what are bonds? Bonds are a form of long-term borrowing that the state uses to raise money for infrastructure projects. The state sells bonds to investors and agrees to repay the investors with interest according to a specified schedule. Why are bonds used? Well, projects such as roads, educational facilities, prisons, parks, office building, housing for veterans, all involve large dollar costs and are used over many years. The use of bonds helps to fund the initial large dollar costs, which would be hard to pay for out of day-to-day operating revenues. Also, the repayment of bonds over time means that future taxpayers who benefit from the facilities will help to pay for them. What type of bonds does the state sell? General obligation bonds are the most significant type of bonds and are largely repaid from the state's general fund, which is supported primarily by income and sales tax revenues. These bonds must be approved by voters, and their repayment is effectively guaranteed by the state. The bonds proposed in Prop 14 are general obligation bonds. There are also revenue bonds repaid from a designated revenue stream, such as bridge tolls, and lease revenue bonds that are repaid from lease payments by state agencies using the leased facilities. Neither type requires voter approval, nor is their repayment guaranteed by the state. The state must repay the principal amount of the bonds plus interest over time to the investors until the bonds are fully paid off. The interest cost of repaying bonds depends primarily on the current interest rate and on the time period over which the bonds have to be repaid. It is expected that the $5.5 billion in new bonds proposed by Prop 14 would be sold over an 11-year period and that the bonds would be repaid over 30 years. Based on those figures, the annual cost to the state will be about $260 million a year for the next 30 years. I said I'd give you background information on the state's current bond debt. The state currently has about $80 billion in general fund supported bonds on which it is making principal and interest payments. In addition, the voters and the legislature have approved about $38 billion of general fund supported bonds that have not yet been sold. Most of these bonds are expected to be sold in the coming years as additional projects need funding. In 2019-2020, the general fund's bond repayments total close to $7 billion. I also told you I would tell you the impact of Prop 14 if it is approved. One indicator of the state's debt burden is the portion of the state's annual general revenues that must be set aside to make yearly payments on the debt. That's called the debt service ratio. The DSR is now around 4% of the annual general fund revenues. If voters approve Prop 14, it is estimated that the DSR will increase by about 1/5 of 1 percentage point compared to what it otherwise would have been over the next couple of years. Thank you for listening. I hope you've learned a little bit more about bonds.
Hello, my name is Priya Vidula. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters and a medical school student. I'm going to be talking with you about the only bond measure on the ballot for Californians, Proposition 14. It authorizes bonds to continue stem cell research. So here's the deal. In 2004, California voters passed Proposition 71. It was a $3 billion bond, but it created the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, and it funded projects for stem cell research, developing potential treatments for many diseases using stem cells, and undertaking clinical trials for new potential treatments, among many other things. In the last 16 years, the agency has funded more than 64 clinical trials and more than 3,000 scientific articles about stem cell research. So let's talk about Prop 14. It's the one that's on your ballot this year, and it's asking for the sale of a $5.5 billion bond to continue funding grants for additional research, medical training, building research facilities, and developing stem cell treatments. It's also going to set aside some funding for research and development for treatments for diseases affecting the brain, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Additionally, it's going to do some reorganization of the governing board and include other measures to increase patient access to stem cell research. Now, the total costs are estimated at $7.8 billion over a 30-year period. So this is going to include the $5.5 billion bond, as well as $2.3 billion in interest to repay the bondholders. But this fiscal effect does not include the revenue source that would come from research or treatments that could result from such an endeavor. And it's also not going to include the number of lives that could potentially be saved from advancements in such research. So what are people saying about it? Well, supporters say that the money is needed for researchers to continue working towards finding new cures for new diseases. For instance, stem cell research from California itself has included over 2,900 medical discoveries. This proposition is supported by more than 70 patient advocate organizations. And finally, the $3 billion bond that we had talked about in 2004 generated $10.7 billion in economic stimulus. What are opponents saying? They're saying that since there are no longer federal limits on stem cell research, which was the reason that the state got involved in the first place, there might not be a need for this bond. Their argument is that California can't afford the bond in an economic crisis and that repayment will lead to increased taxes. They also say that private investors and companies have made great strides in stem cell research and cures, and that there might not be a need for public funding. The League of Women Voters presents the pros and cons in a nonpartisan, impartial manner. However, the League also studies these issues in depth and has taken a position on several of these propositions. So if you want to know the League's position on any of these or other propositions, go to the state website at www.lwvc.org. Thank you so much.